Welcome, everyone, to the Actors Fund's Wednesday Forum, The Future of Work in a COVID-19 Economy. Our goal with these forums is to feature guest speakers who are experts in their fields, to share information and knowledge on a range of work and financial management strategies. We hope through these forums to provide connection and community to help you navigate the multitude of challenges brought on by COVID-19. My name is Christopher Bloodworth, and I am the National Director of the Career Center here at the Actors Fund. My team and I would like to thank each of you who have logged on for taking time out of your day to join us for this important conversation. As many of you know, our mission here at the Fund is to foster stability and resiliency by providing a safety net for performing arts and entertainment professionals over your lifespan. If there are people joining us today who are in need of financial assistance, please visit our website, www.actorsfund.org, to learn how you can apply for financial support via our online portal. Our entire staff is working diligently to review and respond to each of your requests as quickly as possible. Today, we are privileged to have a panel of experts who will help us understand the impact of COVID-19 is having on our economy and the world of work. My team and I have been continuously working to understand the breadth and scope of this economic reality in order to best support all of you in getting through it. What we know now is more than 22 million individuals across this country are out of work and have filed for unemployment. And given the delays and backlogs, the actual number of lost jobs is almost certainly higher. Our guests today will help us understand and begin to make sense out of a truly incomplete recovery picture. Additionally, they will help those of you who are currently working or actively seeking work understand your employee rights in regards to a safe, healthy work environment during these unusual times. Our first two guests today will help us consider the future of work from an economist's perspective. Dr. Stephanie Luce is the chair and professor of labor studies at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. She has worked as an economist at the US Department of Labor and has written extensively on employment, wages, labor policy, and labor organizing. Chris Farrell is the senior economics contributor at Marketplace, an American public media nationally syndicated public radio business and economic program. He's published 5 books on personal finance and the economy, and he's been published in Bloomberg Business Week, the New York Times, and other esteemed publications. Thank you both for joining us.
Well, thank you for having us.
So COVID-19 can easily be summarized as the great interruption. For performing arts and entertainment professionals, the economic downturn in the last 5 weeks has had an immediate and severe impact on their financial health. Millions are facing a pandemic without the financial support of industry and non-industry work. In your estimation, what will be the long-term impact of COVID-19 on our economy?
Stephanie, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I can say that things look pretty grim. Most of the experts are predicting a long-term impact for the next year and a half, and perhaps longer. And really, the impact on workers here in the United States looks drastic. Some of the predictions, the predictions vary, but some of the predictions suggest up to 47 million people unemployed by this summer, which will be about a third of our workforce, which is higher than we had during the Great Depression. So from the perspective of work, things look really drastic. And we can, I'll let Chris say more, but the one thing I just want to emphasize is it doesn't necessarily have to be as drastic as it is if we had public policies to address it. Let me turn it to Chris.
Well, I think those public policies are incredibly important. That, one of the things that we've had the discussion for the past, 3-4 decades about the rise of income inequality. And oftentimes it has kind of an abstract quality to it, and it has become real. So many gig economy workers, so many contingent workforce workers, have lost their jobs, are not part of the social safety net. I was excited when the unemployment insurance system was opened up to the self-employed, but it's turned out not to be working very well. So I agree with you. I think there are a lot of these public policy issues are going to unfold over the coming years. But as this economy comes back, and it's going to come back slowly, there was a hope very early on that we were going to have, if you're making a picture, you're going to draw a V, and everyone's kind of agreed that's not going to happen. We're going to come back slowly. People are going to come back slowly. And so there are going to be a lot of people looking for work. So I think this is fair to say that labor, which does not have a very strong negotiating position in the US economy anyway, at least one impact of this over the next several years is that labor's position is going to be weaker, because there's going to be lots of people looking for work, lots of people are going to want to work, and therefore they may accept wages or benefits or lack of benefits that would be less than desirable.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, we're seeing numbers right now that's equivalent to the time of 1929, the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So listening to the two of you, we can really begin to prepare ourselves for a very difficult time ahead.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go.
It's a life-changing moment, because we're going to enter into it faster than the Great Depression, and it's going to be more global. And one thing that's particularly frightening is, I think, if you compare it to the 2008 crisis. In 2008, the Chinese economy was relatively strong and could kind of pull us out a bit faster than maybe it otherwise would. In this case, China's, even if they're saying they're having addressed the virus, they're having trouble restarting their economy. And I think we're looking at a really global problem that is really something none of us have ever experienced in our lifetime.
And just to sort of add to that, no, I've used the word, you're seeing the word that, economists really ever rebelled against using the word depression. And back in the 2008 downturn, there was a lot of economists pushed back hard when people wanted to use the word depression. This time around, people are using that word depression. There's just, the word recession just doesn't seem to capture. But if you look at the Great Depression, 1929, rounding out the numbers, unemployment rate's about 3%, and 4 years later, it's almost 25%. The difference this time around is this depression is probably going to be a lot shorter, because we sort of know we need more testing, we're going to come up with more procedures, we will reopen more parts of the economy. So I don't think this is like the Great Depression in terms of a long-term unemployment rate, but what it is an economy that's going to sputter, it's going to stutter, it's going to expand a little bit, then it's going to retreat as perhaps the virus comes back. And as we learn better about how to do treatments, organizations figure out how to test their employees when they're coming to work, and the costs of those tests go down. So this is why I think this is this sense of it's going to be a long slog out of this downturn.
Awesome. What industries do you think will be hardest hit as a result of this downturn?
Well, definitely the arts is going to really suffer. It's going to be arts and entertainment, tourism, and retail, restaurants. But I think the other thing to think about is the public sector. Already states were having trouble due to the tax cuts that we saw last year. We knew state budget cuts were coming, and this is just going to exacerbate it. I think even with the CARES Act, we're still hearing from governors and mayors about really severe, drastic cuts to the education sector, to some healthcare, to social services, to public transit. And we're even seeing cases where some of the, for example, higher ed institutions are getting some of the stimulus money, but they're still laying off workers. So I think, the hospitality and leisure industries and culture industries, but also the public sector will be really hit hard.
And you're going to see some expansion in a sort of a public health infrastructure, which is really something we haven't seen for a long period of time. We have a medical complex and we have a hospital complex, but I think I see what you think, Stephanie, but as companies begin to test their workers more, they're going to need, and so organizations will be doing that. They'll be investing in that, but they'll need a public health infrastructure in order to complement what they're doing. So we will see some employment growth in public health, which hasn't been happening for a long period of time. You'll see more investment in there. You know, you can look at, you know, Amazon and Walmart and some of the stores that have really invested heavily in digital technology are going to come out ahead. Because oftentimes when you look at a recession, the companies or industries that do well during that downturn typically do well, continue to do well when the upturn comes in. So those are some sectors, just they're dwarfed. They're dwarfed by what Stephanie was just talking about. But there are some sectors of the economy that are probably going to grow, and that might be some of them.
Okay, so we're talking about health infrastructure. We're talking about potentially internet and or tech companies will see some growth. Are there any other spaces, Stephanie, where you see or can anticipate growth? And I guess one of the reasons why I'm asking this is because I want the folks who are on this call to begin to think about where might they begin to position their curiosities and interests as we are pulling ourselves out of this or during it.
Well, you know, my dream is that we think about models from the past and in other countries in which we have a public investment in the arts. We did this in the 1930s. New York and San Francisco did it in the 1970s, in which they paid people as public sector workers to produce theater and music and art. This is a big project in the Nordic countries that have done this for decades, which is that they consider that part of the public good, which is to put people on public payroll to provide cultural work. Now I realize that's a long haul, that's a long fight to win that, but I wanted to hold that up as to say that's really possible. And we did it in the 1930s where people were getting the equivalent of $2,000 a month to be cultural workers. Short of that, I do think there's space for growth in training and coaching, online education places where people in the arts may be pursuing other kinds of training each other or, you know, being creative about how we deliver cultural work. I think there's going to have to be new forms of that. And again, something like either public payment for that or a universal basic income would make that much more realistic.
Mm. Anything to add, Chris?
Yeah, and piggybacking on that, I think that you're going to see increased jobs in, I'll just use the gig economy broadly defined, right? Not in the narrow sense, but as a word that sort of captures the contingent workforce. And there's going to be a lot of jobs there. There's going to be a lot of opportunity there. The real question is, if you're trying to raise a family, it doesn't come with health insurance. It doesn't come with retirement savings. It doesn't come with paid sick leave. And so you could actually create a fairly optimistic scenario where we end up with a much more flexible economy where people are doing more gig work, sometimes full-time employment, sometimes they're in part-time employment, depending on what's happening in the economy. But they're able to do that because you have universal health care and you have a universal retirement savings plans. Because one of the things that's really wrong in our system is if you lose your job, your family loses their health insurance. And I know there's this thing called COBRA, but the fact is nobody can afford COBRA if they've lost their job. They just can't. And so you can model an economy where there's greater flexibility, which has been, you know, survey after survey, whether you're a younger worker or an older worker, an experienced worker, flexibility is big. A lot of resistance in the economy, but we do have the technology that's there, but it doesn't work if you just simply say, by the way, you as an individual are taking all the risk. But if it's a word people don't like, but if you socialize the risk, then I think you will create a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities for artists, but for also lots of other people.
Great, thank you. You know, I'm listening and thinking about what you said just a little while ago, Chris, that we're we're hitting this faster than in the past, and we're likely going to come out of it quickly. But my question, I guess, to dive a little bit deeper into that is, given all of the components that measure and sustain an economy, when might we begin to see an economic resurgence?
So we're not going back to where we were, all right? So it's an economy that's operating about at 80%, right? 80% employment, 80% of our economy is operating. 20% people are unemployed, 20% isn't working. It's gonna take time to get that 20%, right? It's really gonna unfold over a period of time. The only thing that I do think is, because we are gonna get more testing, and there will be technology advances, and and masks will become easy to get, and they're going to be redesigned so that when you put a mask on and you're wearing glasses, you can actually see instead of getting everything fogged up, right? There's going to be these little advances, because it's not safe in the workplace if your glasses are fogged up, and we know this. So there are going to be advances. There are going to be treatment, hopefully a vaccine, but that's farther out more than likely. But I do think that companies are going to come up with ways to bring their workforce back. But it's not going back to the way we were. If you were working in an orchestra, you might be working in front of very few people, and maybe it's partially in the audience, but partially people are going to be elsewhere. If you're a company that has a building with 400 people in it, when we come back, and I'm talking about coming back, you're probably only going to bring back 200, because you're going to reconfigure how it's designed. And you're going to be hiring people that are going to be put a wand across someone's face in order to see what is their temperature and all the other things that are going to go until we have a vaccine, if we get one. So it's an unfolding. But it's a real coordination problem. It's a deep coordination problem that will not be easy to solve.
Great, thank you, Chris. Stephanie, what are your thoughts in terms of when we might see an economic resurgence?
Well, yeah, people are talking about at least another year and a half before we have a real vaccine and we can really get fully back in. And I think that, I agree with Chris's analysis that it's going to come back slowly. And I also think the other way of thinking about it is, maybe using this moment to restructure work that works better for people in terms of having a work-family balance. One way to think about that is reducing the work week and sharing the work, so that, for example, if you have teachers with half the class sizes, that you have just double the number of teachers, but with smaller groups, and that everyone works a bit less and we share the work. And I think this is, again, the way that countries like Germany handled the 2008 recession and came out of it better than other countries, is because they reduced the work and shared it across more of the population. But again, these will take a lot of political will to make those kind of solutions happen. So I think looking at how fast our economy recovers depends so much on the policy choices that we make over the next coming 6 months or so.
Yeah. What's interesting in what I'm hearing from the two of you, at least I got glimpses of it from the two of you, is this idea of the shifting ways in which the workplace will look. It won't look the same. For many arts workers, flexibility is an important factor in securing additional streams of income to offset the complications of an episodic career, right? Is it possible that the workforce is ready to support a growing remote work economy? Are we ready for that?
We're taking a big step toward it. We've had close to the technology to do it, but managements have largely been very wary for ideological reasons, for reasons of control, for reasons of power, to embrace what technology allows. And I think now they've had no choice, right? And so many people have gone into teleworking, and it's probably, the numbers are a little bit mixed, but it's probably about 30, no more than 40% of jobs right now can be done by telework. With time passes, that number will probably increase. And most of the people who can do telework jobs tend to be white collar workers, tend to be better educated. There are many that are in the arts that can do it. But that will probably expand. It still comes down in a way to power. Is management willing to say, you know what, all I really care is that you get the job done. I actually don't care where you get it done or when you get it done. And yes, when we're doing a Zoom or whatever sort of meeting that we're going to have, that you're actually going to be there. That's a real cultural shift on management's part. We've had the technology, and I think people work and they want to do their job. They want to do a good job. So it's really, can we shift the mindset of the powerful?
Awesome. Stephanie?
Yeah, I have a similar response. And I think the more that we can involve workers themselves and our customers, our students, our patients in the use of technology, the better, because we know what works and what doesn't work. For example, in the teaching world, most of the research shows that online teaching doesn't work as well. However, it allows more accessibility for people that maybe can't leave their home due to illness or other reasons. So technology is a useful tool. We want to use it where it helps people, but we want to also create spaces to maybe do a hybrid of using those technologies so that they're for the public good. So for example, moving to a space where you have some students in person and some online, you know, or where you have, as Chris said earlier, a performance might be some of the audience is in person and some is online. Using the audience and the actors to say, how do we use this technology best is the way to go.
Awesome. And can I just add one thing on top of that? Because it just made me think of, I think in terms of for craft or artists, community is going to become even more important than it has been. Sort of, if you're going to have smaller audiences, you know, really having ties to your local community, you may not make much money, but it means that you will have, you know, you'll have a base where I think it's going to be a little bit harder, at least for a period of time, more of the sort of national moving around, even going overseas. But with that local base and just what Stephanie was talking about, sort of these hybrid models, it may be an intriguing aspect of this whole thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Luce and Chris, for sharing your insight. I see in the Q&A section, there are about 44 questions in there that people have asked during this conversation. So if you two don't mind taking a look at some of those questions and seeing if you can summarize a response, I'd appreciate that. And we'll come back to you in a little bit when we get to the more general Q&A. So thank you so much for your insight. Our third guest of the day, Frank Moss, is partner with the law firm Spivak Lipton, which primarily represents varied guilds and unions in the entertainment field, including performers, stagehands, writers, scenic artists, costume designers, and more. He also teaches a course in arts and entertainment labor law. Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, great.
Thanks for joining us, Frank. You know, because of the episodic nature of the arts and entertainment industry, many performing arts and entertainment professionals must maintain hyphenated careers in order to make ends meet. Many on this call are likely classified as essential workers and are actively working or, because of economic concerns, actively seeking out work. Some may or may not be dealing with an autoimmune deficiency, going through medical treatments, or recovering from an illness. What responsibility do employers have to provide a safe workplace for their employees?
Well, the simple answer is they have the obligation to provide a safe workplace. The real question is, what does that mean? And there are very few clear answers in this pandemic universe. OSHA, which is the federal agency with primary responsibility for ensuring safety in the workplace, has essentially been absent from the dialogue. They have failed to give any guidance or instructions in terms of personal protective equipment, in terms of what needs to be done in order to ensure a safe workplace in the COVID world. There are other sources of safety and insurances. Many states have, in fact, promulgated rules or regulations for people to maintain social distance, 6 feet or whatever. It's not clear from state to state whether those are legally enforceable. They're really, in many cases, just guidelines. There's also the dynamic pressure of workers' compensation laws. And in many states, at least for essential workers, the states have determined that if you get coronavirus illness, as it is going to be presumed that if you've been at work, that you got it at work, and so you will be eligible for workers' comp. But most employers aren't really focusing on that issue. In many cases, what you need to rely on is the union, if there is a union. And many of the unions have been proactive, particularly in the healthcare industry, to try to pressure their employers to provide safe work environments, including masks, gloves, and so forth, ensuring social distancing and so forth. But they haven't been fully effective, and there have been many dynamic pressures and some litigation by some of the nurses' unions, including the New York Nurses Union, against employers because of their failure to, in fact, ensure a safe work environment. Finally, under the National Labor Relations Act, you don't have to work if the working conditions are unreasonably dangerous. But there are a couple of problems. One, that doesn't mean you necessarily get paid, which is what everybody wants. And second of all, it's very hard to determine what exactly it means to say that the work environment is unreasonably dangerous.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. You know, a lot of people have been really concerned about the workplace and what it might mean to be connected to work at this time. I was listening to the news this morning, and there are a lot of people who are working in the food industry in one particular city and town that close to 90% of their cases are coming from this one plant that's preparing food. So my question to you around this is, if a person can build a case, is their employer required to allow them to work remotely?
Unfortunately, generally the answer is no. I guess if you can show that the work site is unreasonably dangerous and you can do your job just as well remotely, you certainly have a very good argument, but there's very little in the way of legal compunction. The only area where there is potential legal compunction is if you have a disability that makes you particularly vulnerable to coronavirus. Let's say, I think diabetics, for example, maybe. And in that case, the EEOC has made clear that the employer has an obligation to make a reasonable accommodation, which in some cases may involve remote work. But the EEOC has given, but it's also sort of taken at the same time, because it has said that because of the pandemic, a lot of employers are facing financial problems. And if there are additional costs, it may not be reasonable for the employer to incur them. I guess that means in terms of remote computers, other equipment, and so forth. So that in theory, the employer has an obligation to engage in reasonable accommodations, which might in some cases involve allowing you to work remotely if you have some sort of pre-existing condition that makes you more vulnerable. On the other hand, the EEOC has been very careful to point out that employers are facing budgetary problems, and therefore what might in other circumstances be a reasonable accommodation nowadays is not. Unfortunately, these agencies have appointees who are appointed by a president who may not be as sympathetic to employee interests as he is to employer interests.
Great, great, thank you. There are several accounts being brought to light of employers silencing employees, requiring them to not disclose if they are currently sick or were recently sick. What is an employer's obligation to identify ill employees and or customers towards protecting their staff and customer base?
Well, there's no clear answer or clear guidelines. Again, the employer does have an obligation to provide for a safe work environment, both under federal occupational safety and health law, as well as under many state laws. But there hasn't been clear guidance, certainly from any federal agency, as to exactly what needs to be done. Clearly, there's been talk. There's been talk of employers checking people with thermometers. Indeed, in some foreign countries, I see that's already being done. But right now, there's no legal compunction. In the entertainment industry, there is a safety committee in the motion picture industry that has been established jointly by the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers and the guilds and unions. The hope is in that industry, where many people I assume on this webinar are normally employed, we assume that there will be some guidance from the committee as to how to provide for a safe environment at such time as the industry resumes production, because right now the industry is effectively dead.
Yeah. Thank you. I mentioned at the top of this call that millions of people have been laid off or furloughed as a result of COVID-19. Can you speak to their rights related to healthcare coverage and retirement benefits?
Sure. Most people in America get their coverage through employers, as Chris pointed out. In most cases, your coverage ends when your employment stops. And for many, many millions of people, their coverage either stopped at the end of March or will stop at the end of April because they are no longer employed. That has meant a lot of potential political chaos. I know that it's been reported that for what I guess would be the fifth coronavirus law, the Democrats in the House, at least, will be pushing for some sort of a COBRA subsidy, so that people who lose their work and hence their health benefits as a result of the pandemic will at least get a partial or complete subsidy for COBRA. But of course, knowing politics in Washington, there's no certainty at all that anything will in fact be enacted in that regard. In the entertainment industry, ironically, at least for the unionized employees, relatively few people have lost their coverage as of yet, because typically, because most employment is freelance, there are these multi-employer plans. People get their coverage for 3 months or 6 months or a year based upon work in a prior 3 month, 6 month, or 1 year period. And for most people, because of work prior to the pandemic, they have continued coverage. And many of the plans in the industry have actually made some steps to assist. Some are in better financial shape than others and can. Some of the plans have reduced or eliminated participant premiums, which cost some money. Others have actually agreed to extend coverage to give certain credit for people who've lost work, so that it'll be a longer period of time before they face loss of coverage. Ironically, what may happen is that when people go back to work, they may, at that point, be losing coverage because during the prior 3 months or 6 months, they didn't have sufficient work to get the coverage. And so you're going to have that in a delayed fashion. And few of the plans in the entertainment industry have the financial wherewithal to sustain continued coverage when they're not getting contributions for an extended period of time. And so, although the crisis in the entertainment industry is probably, in large respects, going to be delayed, it's going to be just as serious, or perhaps even more serious, because people are freelance employees. And when you go back to work, you don't just get your coverage typically. In terms of retirement benefits, retirement plans, both corporate plans and multi-employer union plans, have been badly hit by the financial crisis. Some of the plans were already in trouble and are likely to face collapse, frankly. Others may end up having to cut benefits. In the short run, many plans have in fact taken steps to assist participants, particularly the individual account defined contribution plans under the CARES Act. Plans have been allowed to expand the loans that they may give to up to $100,000 loans from people's accounts if you have an account. In addition, there are coronavirus distributions permitted under the CARES Act. And most of the individual account plans in the entertainment industry, at least, have taken advantage in part or in whole of the right to get a distribution of up to $100,000. Many of the plans have made a smaller number, but the law allows up to $100,000 as a distribution if you've been affected by the pandemic. And you can pay the taxes on that over 3 years. There are no penalties on the early distribution. And in fact, you can, over the 3-year period, repay the money if you're back at work and able to earn. So the plans are doing what they can. Unfortunately, they're providing benefits and they're not getting any income because the entertainment industry is almost completely shut down, both in terms of live performance and in terms of motion picture and television. There are people still working in news, but that's about it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the clarity on the penalties and the tax rollover. I really appreciate that, because that was my first thing, was what are the penalties associated with an early distribution? So my final question to you, Frank, is that at the Career Center, a common challenge many of our participants speak to is age discrimination. Given that some individuals in our society are more at risk because of underlying medical conditions, are there laws in place to protect people from overt and/or covert discrimination when it comes to job searching and being hired, et cetera?
Yes, and in fact, on that, the EEOC has come out very clearly that in terms of work conditions as well as job opportunities, you cannot discriminate against an older person merely because you think that older people are more likely to get covered. So that there is a clear prohibition against any kind of discrimination in hiring or in the terms and conditions of employment. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Frank. There's been more questions added to the Q&A. If you get a chance, just view some of them. We're going to speak about some of those as we move forward, but thank you. Thank you so much for offering your advice. Our fourth guest of the day, Andres Puerta, is the Director of Special Projects at the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 30. Andres has worked with trade unions for over 2 decades as an organizer and educator, including film, television, radio, construction, and engineering. He recently led the unionization campaign at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City and has unionized several cultural institutions over the last few years. Thank you for joining us, Andres.
Thank you very much. Good to see everyone.
So a significant number of performing arts and entertainment professionals on this call belong to one of the arts and entertainment unions. And they know firsthand the important role unions play in ensuring workers are protected. Given the life and death circumstances that are being imposed on US workplaces at this pivotal time in history, what role, if any, should organized labor play in assisting workers during the COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a great question. I think that there are a lot of unions today struggling with exactly what those answers are, just because of the, like Professor Luce mentioned, that it happened so fast. So obviously the first priority I feel for trade unions, for workers, is a safe workplace. And as Frank said, you know, OSHA's sort of disappeared in this respect. And I think it's been where workers are unionized, it's imperative that the unions speak up and make sure that all possible protections are in place, whether that's on a film set, in a newsroom, or in a poultry plant. That's sort of, you know, for me, this priority number one is making sure that people have a safe and healthy workplace. Other than that, I think some unions have been doing this. It's really protecting the standards that unions have fought for in the industry. And so specifically for, you know, film, TV, news, radio, a lot of these unions have industry-wide agreements, and those industry-wide agreements set standards that allow performers and cultural workers and journalists to sort of work in safe environments, but also for standard working conditions and protections. And as was mentioned, where there's just going to be, you know, this non-union sort of emergence. Now, the non-union sector has been emerging for a long time, but where, you know, this now becomes an economic sort of issue, it's really, I think, critical for working people and their unions to defend the standards that have been won over decades of collective bargaining.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, there's been a movement, as I'm sure you know, across the United States to kind of, you know, push aside unions and the right to organize people and work. And Frank, in his comment, brought up the National Labor Relations Act. And I was wondering if you could speak to the importance of that act and protected concerted activity, and how non-union workers, our folks who are maybe in non-union secondary work environments, can work together to stay safe at work.
Yeah. So as an organizer, a longtime organizer and trade unionist, the concerted protected activity is really the base of how we unionize workplaces, how we unionize workers. It's in the National Labor Relations Act, which was passed in the 30s, which coincidentally was partly a response to the Great Depression and to the worker uprising of the 30s to say, hey, the economy collapsed, we all suffered, we're not okay with this, and we want to change things and be able to defend ourselves the next time. Protected concerted activity exists in that document, the National Labor Relations Board, which is the agency, a federal agency that is there to protect the rights in the act. That's where any sort of conflict would go. But generally, where there's more than one person, and this includes online spaces, talking about their working conditions, wanting to talk about improving them, wanting to talk about, you know, possibly sitting with an employer and negotiating a union contract or speaking up for their rights at work, they're protected under this concept, right? It's, as long as it's concerted, it's protected activity. Obviously, there's all sorts of case law over 50 years, kind of defining it at the edges. But for working people that are now in a workplace where they want to do better and they want to build some power and have the leverage necessary to improve their lives, that's what they would be using. That's what unions use in all sorts of strike scenarios, picketing scenarios, organizing campaigns, bringing workers together and demanding a voice at work.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. One of the things that I pulled out of Stephanie's and Chris's conversation is that because of the nature of this economic downturn, that it is going to be felt by a lot of people, and people are going to have to think differently about what their preferred salary or earning range is, right? But what I'm seeing and what I'm finding is that many of the current jobs that are in demand right now are non-union, low-wage positions that are essential to keeping our economy alive. What is the likelihood that the people in these positions and some of our people on the call who might have to take these positions during this in-between time, that we will see a pay increase to match their need?
Yeah, great question. And as an organizer, I would say let's eliminate the likelihood part of it, and let's just come together, join a union, and demand a wage increase. But I think what's been happening in this period that might not receive the press is workers have been doing this. Amazon workers at Amazon, which falls into this low wage category, that are now essential. They have been having strikes in major cities like Detroit and New York. Fast food workers all throughout California that are part of the Fight for 15 campaign have been walking off the job. Whole Foods, which is owned by Amazon, workers there are using concerted activity, and they're working with unions, and they're walking off their job for the first time in history. And so there is a response to sort of the stress and pressure that some of these, like you said, low-wage workers are facing now. And they're coming together and sort of demanding better. And, the Instacart, for example, the Instacart workers, which is part of the gig economy, have been more.
And a lot of our folks work for or have worked for Instacart. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. There's an Instacart movement happening now. And this, just to prove that this isn't just, an idea that, hopefully works, this is very effective. Whole Foods, to the worker turmoil, has responded with a $2 an hour wage increase during this period. Amazon has responded the same. Instacart has responded with a $5 increase for orders. And we would like to think that it's out of, their goodwill, and they realize that working people are essential workers now, and these low wage positions are really, struggling, and they want to do it for the right reasons. And some people can give them the benefit of, the doubt there. I choose to believe it's because workers have been pushing back and making some demands, even not in a union setting, right? I mean, these aren't unionized workers. They're still protected by the NLRA, right? And certainly we know that there have been unions that have been talking to the workers at Whole Foods for some time, at Amazon for some time. And so, yes, it's in a union setting, but the noise that they've made when they've come together and they've kind of put up this fight has had real economic results. The question for them is the $2 an hour wage increase that they got now because they started pushing back. How do they keep it and make it better when this is over?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think that is so important because, again, given where we are right now, people are going to have to make really difficult decisions about work and salary and earnings, and to know that they can do something really, I think, and that things are being done, I think really helps them to do it in a very mindful way. My final question for you, from a labor organizing perspective, how important is this moment in history in regards to workers understanding the role they can play towards improving their overall working conditions?
Yeah, critical. I think back to moments of crisis and how working people have responded. As we mentioned, the Great Depression, which sort of becomes this moment when people are able to associate what happens when an economy collapses. The strike wave that happened during the Depression and after Depression was unprecedented, right? Workers struck for not only union recognition, but for better working conditions. And they responded to the economic collapse. 2018, we saw one of the highest strike waves that we've seen since the mid 80s. And last year, that kind of stayed at the same numbers. And so over the last couple of years, we've seen workers take major action to defend themselves and to make the system better for them than it is now. Like I said, I think that yes, there's going to be an incredible amount of stress and pressure on trade unions. As was mentioned in the beginning of this conference, they're going to be, might be in a weakened position as all this competition emerges with high unemployment. That is all true. But I think what is also true is that unions can do the hard work it takes to organize workers and not let these pressures really break standards that have been established by trade unions, by working people, and come out of this swinging. And I think that that's doable. I think that you can see it in the entertainment and cultural industry now. The Writers Guild has very, big, aggressive campaigns that they're maintaining through this period. I know that other unions have sort of forced secondary players. So there's the advertising agencies and there's the advertisers to adhere to standards. This is all within the realm of possibility. This is it can apply pressure at the very top of an industry where it's needed. And yeah, I mean, working people can say, we're not going to let this break the standards of what we need and what our unions fought for, which is good wages, standard wages throughout an industry, healthcare, retirement. I think it's doable, and hope, the hope is, the dream is, as Professor Luce says, that unions come out swinging and stay swinging.
Yeah, I'm sure that you heard and paid attention to a lot of what was happening on the vote towards the Unemployment Expansion Act, and how a lot of Congress persons were saying that what they would be getting would be more than what they were normally making, which was laughable in and of itself. So it's good to know that these things can be changed and will be changed as we move forward. So thank you, Andres, for your insight, and thank you all for your insight. I want to turn now to some of the questions and answers that we've gotten, and spend some time going through some of them. All right, so someone asked, what is the likelihood of their job being of there being job opportunities outside of essential businesses post-19 quarantine? Also, where do you see the trajectory of the arts, especially dance companies, considering the state that we're in? And that can go to, I think, some of the economists, either Chris or Stephanie.
You have a thought, Chris, or?
So the only thought that I have, and I don't know enough about dance companies, except for remember reading an economic study by Ann Markuson years ago, that per capita, the Twin Cities, where I am based, has more dance companies than anywhere else, which always was a nice thing sort of to hear. I do think that off of what you had said, Stephanie, I do think there is going to be increased pressure for government support. I do think that's going to happen. I also think that you're going to have a step up by philanthropists, but it may end up being a system that rewards those who have done well will continue to do well. Where I think in the arts, one of the things that's going to come out of this is there are going to be a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities, and there's going to be a lot of experimentation. And I think that's really exciting. The problem with it is that it's oftentimes these things are exciting and they're creative and they allow for purpose and they allow for a passion, but it's also very hard to make a living. And that is the story before of the arts pre-COVID. So, and now in the post-COVID world, I think that, the way that I look at it is probably a lot of opportunities on the entrepreneurial side that we're not really sort of thinking about, but there's lots of people who are coming up with ideas. I'm participating, a friend who's a jazz musician in London lost his job. He had a side job tasting whiskey. And now what we're doing is we're having a global whiskey tasting in about a week. And, it's all being mailed to us and everything. And it's very creative. But of course, the income's not going to be anywhere near what he had before. So again, I think there will be creative opportunities. What I worry about is on the income side.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting is, one of the reasons the death rate is higher than it might be is people in this country, there's a lot of poor health to begin with because we have a very underfunded and a poor healthcare system, right? And I think one of the things we're saying, this is an unprecedented crisis. It's a space to make transformations. And one is to refocus on what makes a healthy life. Like, do we have community health workers that have people have access to the resources and education to create a healthy lifestyle? And I think part of that is access to dance and movement and theater and culture. That is partly also what keeps us healthy, right? So, I mean, a lot of it is also about, just having fair wages, having the actual income to buy the foods and healthcare you need. But I think we want to promote this idea of a well-rounded life that is balancing so that people aren't working, either 80 hours a week or 10 hours a week. Both of those cause tremendous stress, and then they lead to worse health outcomes in the end. That doesn't necessarily answer the job question, but I think in terms of, thinking about public performance, artists, and again, public investment in the arts, I think is a really crucial demand.
And Christopher, one of the questions that was addressed, just if it's okay, if I can do this,
Sure, yes.
was, does this increase the odds of universal health insurance, universal health coverage? And I think one of the things from what Andrews has said and Frank has said, Steffi and me, the answer to that is yes. Now, whether that happens, obviously, but I do think that so many people are losing their health insurance through no fault of their own. You cannot play the blame game this time around. And whenever that happens, and there is this greater realization about, so many of these low-wage jobs, these are essential workers. That is not a term that has been used. We know that they're essential workers. I mean, one of the things that I find absolutely outrageous, if you think about the home health care aide, the home health care worker, yes, and the value, the importance of the work that they're doing, and yet if you look at their wages, it's abysmal. It's horrible. All right. So, but at least there is a greater appreciation at this moment in time. So I do think the odds, at least, of that discussion being taken more seriously is high.
Yeah, thank you. There was another question. Someone said that I'm a freelance TV journalist. In what ways is this a good time or bad time as a content creator to start our own businesses? Is this the time to start a business?
There is actually a body of research that shows that one of the better times to start a research is when everything is in turmoil, when the economy is down. And part of it has to do with all a lot of your inputs, a lot of your costs are lower. And at the same time, what does an entrepreneur do? An entrepreneur solves a problem. So if you know of a problem that you can solve for an employer or an industry or a business or an organization, then that does open up entrepreneurial opportunities.
Stephanie, any thoughts on that?
I think it's such a hard question to answer because I think it depends so much on the kind of business, and the state you live in. And I guess, what's hard is as I'm reviewing a number of the questions, the answer to your questions really depends so much on the state you live in. I think that we're really looking to policymakers to create the conditions for people to come back to work safely. And so if people have access to safety equipment, if they have access to testing, and if, we could be hiring, Massachusetts is hiring community healthcare tracing. Like they're hiring people to work and go and test, or contact tracing to say, where did the virus develop? And so that's creating a more safe environment for people to return to public work and return to a public economy. So to answer that depends a lot on the state you live in and the kind of business, I think, that you're thinking of starting.
And I don't know if this figure's right or wrong. It's probably a back of the envelope, but in the Financial Times, they think that just the type of worker that you are talking about, that's probably going to be a $3.5 billion industry fairly quickly. Mm-hmm. So, but again, it does depend. It can't just stay in Massachusetts and 7 other states. It has to spread.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think next question can be answered either by Frank or Andres. I work part-time 4 days a week at a senior center. Sometimes I work from home. Sometimes I have to go into the office. Does this qualify me for hazard pay? Is this hazard pay?
The answer is there's no legal obligation whatsoever. An employer doesn't have to pay hazard pay. Some companies are doing that voluntarily or through negotiations with the unions, but there's no obligation.
Someone else asked, Frank, can employers legally make hiring decisions based on whether candidates have COVID-19 antibodies? If not, what action can be taken if it appears they are?
I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I don't know that there's an answer. They may well be able to do that.
Awesome. Question, I think this may be you, Andres. I've heard that labor may be in a stronger position on the other side. What about social impacts of the experience on people's experience in building support for labor? Clarifying, right? The person is clarifying even more. Will this experience of mass unemployment lead to a greater interest in union representation?
Yep, so I hope so. I think, as was said, what's really exciting in these times is social media has opened these campaigns publicly, probably a lot more than they had been in the past. And so these Amazon actions, people can just follow them through the unions that are pushing them, via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And one way, even from socially distanced, support is to support them online. That's certainly, the way you can tag them on Twitter and other platforms. The employers see this stuff, and it almost becomes like a virtual picket line or a virtual leafleting event. And that's something that all of us can do, is support these workers in their campaigns that way. For example, when we organized some of the freelancers and the full-time workers at the Guggenheim last summer, we built a lot of support online through our Twitter handle. And we know from our negotiations with the museum, which are still not done yet, we're still kind of in the negotiating process, even through this crisis, and the museum is shut down, as have a lot of culture institutions. We still have the power to demand bargaining over these jobs, and we will, and we are. We're currently in that process. Again, the Writers Guild's campaigns are very public through Twitter. As an example, in this industry, different shops have started their own Twitter handles and have garnered a ton of support. And so, yes, I think as this economically gets worse and people feel more pain, I think that people will naturally support these new essential workers that are super low waged in our economy, and these budding organizing campaigns at Amazon, at Whole Foods, at Trader Joe's.
Awesome. Someone asked, what about those of us who don't have a union for our field? Dialect coaches or dramaturgs, I'm both, have professional associations, but no labor union or guild. I've never had employer covered insurance or pension. I'm sure I'm not the only one. All right, so what what advice or options do these individuals have?
So I think, and I'll just jump in quick on it. You can organize a union in any workplace. Most workers are covered in the private sector, are covered by the right to unionize. If you are employed in the cultural industry, my suggestion is look around, do the research, especially of the guilds and the unions in that industry. Make some phone calls. The AFL-CIO, which is the sort of the Federation of Trade Unions, they, online, you could just sort of send a question and say, hey, look, I want to organize my workplace. It's all very doable. I know that unions are trying to get out there and organize. Some unions are doing a lot more than others. But these are very confidential, at least our training is, these are very confidential discussions. Obviously, no one talks to an employer before the workers are ready. You should feel very comfortable reaching out to unions in this space and starting that conversation. And obviously, start that conversation with your coworkers too, because that's where the power is.
Yeah. This next question is for you as well as Andreas, but I actually think that any of you on the panel could respond to this as well. Is there a way for unions to start to explore a movement toward government funding the arts? It is something that Europe has, but the US has not yet implemented such a plan. So given where we are and given what we know is happening right now in the arts and entertainment world, is this the time now where we should be thinking about this?
Yeah, I say absolutely, and I shared a link in the chat about from a book that talks about some of the programs in the Nordic countries that have been doing this for decades, and some of that tradition actually goes back hundreds of years to the royal courts that would sponsor art and so forth. But the idea is, again, that art is a public good and culture is a public good. So I think, for example, in Sweden, they have academic appointments for 10 years. For artists to be in residence to teach young artists. Denmark has young artist, young actor grants to start out your career. There's a lot of great examples from other countries of how the country itself invests in art and saying this benefits us all. So I absolutely think this is something we want to push for here. We talk a lot about the Green New Deal, I think the Green New Deal makes a lot of sense. It's talking about rebuilding our infrastructure and making a sustainable planet. But I also, again, we want to think about sustainable human life. What do we need to sustain ourselves? We need food and shelter and healthcare, and we need culture, right? That's part of a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, the unions have in fact been doing that, not with complete success, but for example, there was a very small amount of money originally appropriated, at least proposed by the Republicans, for the National Endowment for the Arts, and partially because of union pressure, additional money was restored, obviously far less than necessary. And indeed, the not-for-profit community, particularly in the live performance part of the community, is hurting horribly. I know the not-for-profit theaters around the country are in desperate shape, and so forth. So money is needed, but it's really politics. The unions have been pushing to some significant degree. The Democrats on Capitol Hill have been supporting that. In many state legislatures, there's been some support. But of course, at the state level, the pressures are enormous right now because the state's in such bad shape. So you really need federal assistance. And that's going to depend on who the president of the United States is.
And just to add, I think that, the position of the states is going to be just terrible. So, because their revenue has fallen, sales tax revenue has fallen. Everything has fallen there. But I do think still that much of this that's going to involve government is going to be public-private partnerships on the local level. And that's where a lot of the activity is, because people are going to try and continue to make this an attractive place to live. You have some negotiating ability. You can break down some of the ideological barriers that are so strong on the national level. It remains somewhat skeptical on the national level. You're going to see a big increase, but I would not be the least bit surprised on the local level that you see a lot more activity.
And just to piggyback all that, yes, I would obviously agree that a national effort, concerted effort to fund the arts, which has been done in the past, and like Professor Luce said, in European countries, is something that I think we can all support as part of a general healthy lifestyle in society. When building campaigns, for example, unions often do the important research work on employers, and the more you kind of dig into the IRS filings, you'll see that they do receive a lot of government support, a lot of cultural institutions. It might be not direct, but it could be in the form of tax subsidies, it could be in the form of grants, public grants. And so for unions, I think this is leverage. And I think that, it's a way to hold employers in the cultural industry, entertainment industry accountable to public tax dollars, and say, look, if you're getting public tax dollars in whatever form, you can't be busting unions. You can't be, you should be supporting workers that are organizing their union. And, that's one way to think about government support of culture institutions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Another question came up for the economists. The person is wondering, do you all have an educated opinion or guess on how the anticipated long-term reduced income among the population, including, of course, radio, TV, actor, performer, production types, will affect real estate, property owners, and potentially lowering rent prices?
So where I think you're going to see the impact up front is less on the residential side and more on the commercial side. So I think that there, in many cities and urban areas, we're going to find out that we have way too much commercial space. And part of the world that we're describing, where people are going more back and forth, means that that's where you're going to see the real decline. I'm skeptical that you're going to see much of a decline on the residential, whether rental or home ownership, because we had a real affordable housing crisis in this country, and it has not gone away. And when the economy, even if the economy is sputtering back, the little train that gathers a little bit of momentum, that affordable housing crisis is going to be there. It has not disappeared. It has not gone away. So, and any construction project that wasn't started has not been started, right? Many people have pulled back, so be a little bit more cautious. So I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to see a whole lot of reduced rents or reduced lower home prices. Some, yes, and right now, there's very little activity going on in the residential real estate market, right? Because this economy's gone down. But I'm kind of skeptical because of this underlying fundamental economic issue we have in this country of affordable housing.
Stephanie, any thoughts in terms of what might happen?
No, I'm not a real estate expert. It's only, it's just hard to make a prediction as to what's going to happen in a city like I'm here in New York City, where people can't pay the rent at all. And so there's got to be a solution, right? So whether it's going to be a solution in terms of government support stepping in to help cover the rent, or whether it's adjustments on creating more affordable housing, it seems very hard to predict what will. I guess just what I would come back to over and over is that we're really in an unprecedented moment. That we really have little history to draw on of a crisis of this scale. But I think what we do know from history, and I'm straying from the question a bit here, is that sometimes in these moments we go in a direction of war and fascism and genocide, and at other moments we go in a moment of global cooperation and public investment and mutual aid. And I think it's up to all of us we're at that crossroads, and we really have to contribute to going in the right direction there in that crossroads, because it can go in a really ugly direction quickly. And the only thing to stop it is our collective will to take it on the right path.
Great, thank you. Frank, what impact will in-office testing have on the HIPAA laws that govern privacy?
Well, an employer's testing does not actually technically implicate HIPAA because HIPAA governs the health plan and not the employer. So there are obviously privacy concerns, and people have raised questions about, should an employer spread the word? Normally you would say no, that's somebody sick, but obviously if the person in the suite next to you is infected, you want to know that. So there is no clear legal guidance, and employers probably can do so.
Awesome. Andreas, this person says, I'm an artist and a performer, but most of my income comes from working as a non-union technician in small dance venues. It feels impossible to join IATSE and continue working in the places I care deeply about. Do you have any advice for folks who work in places where unionizing seems not to be feasible?
Sure, it's doable. And that's not just an eternal optimist that worries a lot perspective. I would reach out to IATSE, and who I understand does cover a lot of these sort of sound tech positions in the industry, and have a conversation with an organizer. I think that sometimes what has happened is that people view the union jobs, especially you see this in New York City a lot, sort of the Broadway jobs, and our members at the Operating Engineers do work on Broadway, do work at Carnegie Hall, in a lot of the iconic cultural venues, we're facilities workers, but some people assume, well, I can't get into that union, or someone's been trying so long to do it and it's not possible for me to get there. I would suggest it is possible for you to join those unions. And the first step is to reach out and say, hey, look, this is what I do. And I want to unionize the places that I work. And I'll just give you a 2-second example. When we organize museums, part of it is a lot of these workers are on what they call on-call workers. They're not full-time, they're not part-time, they're very much freelance, and they jump from institution to institution to institution to make a living. That doesn't prohibit them from joining unions. Our bargaining unit at the Guggenheim is 140 people, only 20 of which are full-time. The other 120 are these freelance positions. And so these, you do have rights to unionize, and you can do that. And I would suggest and support you reaching out to the unions that cover this type of work.
Thank you.
Let me just add, one way to get into a union is to engage in an organizing campaign. If you and fellow workers in a non-union venue get together, the unions will generally immediately make people members once they've successfully organized. So that's one way proactively you can get into a union where you feel normally you would be excluded.
Thank you. I think this question goes to maybe Frank or Andreas. What about a centralized sick leave bank? Our industry, meaning the performing arts and entertainment industry, has challenges for people trying to access sick leave tied to multiple employers. Is there any thought that something like a centralized sick leave bank might be probable?
The answer is no.
I love your directness.
Some industries that are similar to, and I would obviously support the legal position, but some industries, I organized in construction, and there is a sick leave with multiple employers, very similar to sort of the arts industries, where they have, what's called Taft-Hartley plans, which are the benefit plans. They do have policies where if you work for one employer over a period of time, every hour you work, you get sick. They call it a sick bank, and you get an X amount of dollars into a sick bank, and every 3 months you get a check. Doesn't mean you could take sick time, but it's meant to cover you for any time you need to take off if you're unwell. There are creative ways to sort of establish this stuff, and unions, can put their heads together and try to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the musicians local in New York, for example, has it, but an industry-wide bank is not going to happen.
I was just going to say too, in some work, you're right, not industry-wide, but in some places it's also set up very easily to share, to put into the sick bank and then donate your unused time to your coworkers. So it's a nice model to aspire to.
So we have time for one last question, and this is going to Stephanie and Chris. Do you think that the arts and cultural institutions will be the last to go back to work when this COVID-19 crisis recedes? And what will it mean for the long-term futures of those of us employed in these areas?
Well, just to leap in, my sense is that actually where the last is going to be the restaurant worker. And the restaurant worker is going to be really slow because particularly the smaller restaurants, the independent restaurants, the chef-driven restaurants, it's really unclear about what their business model is going to be. I think there's an enormous desire to try and bring back the arts in some way, some form, some fashion. So yes, I don't think it's going to be particularly fast. I think a lot of it is still going to be building off of in a living room, using the internet, some in person, maybe museums with staggered hours and staggered number of people going in. So I think it will be very slow, but I have to say that I'm really concerned about a lot of the workers that are in the restaurant industry, the waiters and the waitresses, and I just think that that is going to be a really slow industry to come back.
Yeah, I do. I can't imagine cultural workers coming back sooner in the ways that Chris talks about and doing it more staggered. I mean, and some of that might mean that the venues have to be subsidized, right? Because to have half the patrons to the museum will require more subsidies. But, places like New York City do, put money into the cultural industry because they know it's worth it, like it's one of our exports, right? Like we export our artistic work. So it's a place that might make sense for places to invest in. So it's a possible avenue to rebuild the economy, is slow, measured return to cultural work.
Yeah, I know I said last question, but I have to ask this question. And it's going to probably be answered by Andres or Frank. This person says, I work as a union makeup artist. We can't have actors wear masks while their makeup is being applied. How will production assure social distancing and safety for makeup artists, hairstylists, and wardrobe people? We are all touching the actors.
Yeah, I've had conversations with unionists in the field, and it's tough. I can tell you that in the news world, where there is still some production going on, makeup artists are consulting with their talent remotely. They're purchasing supplies remotely, but obviously in the long run, that isn't going to work. And it's going to be a problem. And I think, contrary to Chris, I think the industry that's going to come in last is not the restaurant industry, but it's going to be the live performance industry, where it's going to be so hard, not only for the crews and the talent, but also because you need audiences. And if there are going to be limits on gatherings of more than 50 or 25 or even a couple of hundred people, those venues aren't going to be able to operate for many, many, many months, and it's very bleak.
Yeah, similarly, I would say it's one of those, I know, having negotiated contracts and continue to negotiate contracts, that this is one of those events where you're looking through the contracts you've negotiated and said, geez, where do I find the applicable clause here? A lot of union contracts have very generalized health and safety clauses. And I think, this is one place where workers and unions and employers can sit down and say, hey, look, we need to figure this out in good faith together. If it's not explicitly in the union contract, then maybe perhaps it's not grievable. but employers who care about the health and safety of their employees should be willing to sit down and listen to some ideas.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Luce, Chris, Frank, and Andreas for providing the performing arts and entertainment professionals on this call information on how best to understand the future of work in this developing economy. We deeply appreciate your sound advice and hope to remain connected to you as new information related to our economy unfolds. So I'll be reaching out to you possibly for updates, so be on the lookout for that. For those of you who are interested in deepening your understanding about the labor industry, I have a brief announcement. In the fall, on Monday evenings, the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies here in New York City will hold an employment law for arts and entertainment course, which is the first of a 4-course 16-credit certificate. This is an in-person class in New York City, but for those of you who are remote, you can register and participate in the class remotely. So you're not being excluded. So if you're interested in learning more about employment law for arts and entertainment individuals, I'll make sure before we log off that I drop that inside of the chat for you all. Finally, thank you all. Thank you to all of you who logged on, who joined us from around the country. We appreciate all you do to contribute to our country's cultural vibrancy and promise to continue our work towards ensuring each of you are supported, valued, and economically secure. All right? Have a great day and take care of yourselves. I'm going to drop in the chat that information related to the course. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was great to meet all of you also.
Thanks.
Yes.
All right. Have a good one.